Thanks so much for being here today with us as part of the Climate Year Speaker Series. I'm Jen Britton, and I'm part of Drexel's Climate and Sustainability Working Group. And we are having this speaker series about once a month for the rest of the year. So I want to quickly remind everybody to please keep yourselves on mute throughout the panel, at least until we get to the question and answer period and we point to you to ask your question. So this year, this is just a little about Climate Year. We're celebrating, supporting, and cataloging Drexel's ongoing climate work that's happening at all levels of the university and the Academy of Natural Sciences, as well as launching some new initiatives to make combating climate change central to our institutional practices, our curriculum, our research, and our civic engagement. So this Climate Year Speaker Series is one of those initiatives this year. And we're highlighting work from different departments, faculty, and staff throughout Drexel and the Academy. So a couple of our most recent panels included climate risks from headwaters to coast. Before that, we did infrastructure and health, the impacts of COVID and climate on transportation. Our program next month is going to look at climate change and health. Today, our focus is on strategies for addressing climate change. We're going to hear from our three speakers, and then we're going to have time for questions and discussion after each speaker has presented. Before we move along, I want to note that as we build an institutional strategy for climate and sustainability at Drexel, we're doing our best to bring a justice lens to the work. And so in that spirit, I want to do just a quick land acknowledgement. Even though we're all here remotely right now, and some of us are outside of the US, it is the case that we're organized around Drexel and its location in Philadelphia. So to that end, I'm going to read this passage from the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation. The land upon which we gather is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape called Lenapehoking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another on this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and the early federal period, many were removed west and north, but some also remain among the continuing historical tribal communities of the region. We acknowledge that the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief Tamanend that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. So thanks. And now I want to turn things over to our moderator today, Sharif Khalifa. Sharif is a PhD candidate in the Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering under the supervision of Professor Jason Baxter. He joined Drexel in 2002 when he was an undergraduate. In his dissertation work, Sharif evaluates the life cycle environmental and human health impacts associated with deploying renewable energy system technologies, particularly incumbent and emerging solar photovoltaic systems. He also builds modeling tools to quantify material waste streams, resource efficiency, and material availability for solar PV systems that may help in transitioning into a circular economy. He's the recipient of Drexel Chemical and Biological Engineering Outstanding Research Mentor Award and the Joseph and Shirley Carleone Endowed Fellowship. So Sharif, if you would please take it away.
Oh, thank you so much, Jen. It is absolutely my pleasure to be here in this panel discussion today and listen to some of our experts in the field to discuss one of the, or basically the grand scientific, political, and social challenge of our time, and discuss possible solutions to its impending threats. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker for today, Dr. Jason Baxter, who is also my PhD advisor and my great source for inspiration for sustainability. So Dr. Jason Baxter will regale us today about the causes of global warming and some of the solutions that are being discussed to avert its emergency. So a little bit of background about Dr. Jason Baxter is a professor in the Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering here at Drexel, where he began in 2007. His research group focuses on solar energy conversion, and some of the current projects include materials chemistry, and processing of thin films, fabrication and characterization of solar cells, ultra-fast photophysics of solar energy materials, and the life cycle environmental impacts and material flow analysis on industrial scale. He's a recipient of the NSF Career Award and Drexel College of Engineering Outstanding Teacher Award. So in addition to teaching the core classes in chemical engineering, he regularly teaches general interest courses such as fundamentals of solar cells and climate change. It's an honor to have Dr. Baxter here. Dr. Baxter.
Okay, thanks, Sharif. So primarily what I'll be talking about today is solutions. But before we can really understand solutions to climate change, we need to understand the causes. And at bottom, the cause of most aspects of climate change are the fact that the Earth is getting warmer. And it's getting warmer because we are receiving energy from the sun at a higher rate than we are reflecting or re-emitting energy back out into space. And the difference is not a lot. It's about 0.6 watts per square meter. But when you consider the large area of the Earth, this adds up to a large amount of power. The reason why we're a little bit out of balance is changing amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. As we have more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, they absorb more infrared radiation rather than letting it be emitted back out into space. Carbon dioxide is the most important of the greenhouse gases. It has the largest effect cumulatively. Most of the CO2 comes from burning fossil fuels, which we do for energy and for other industrial purposes. But carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas. Another really important one is methane. Methane is coming from both agriculture and from industry, such as fracking and other unintentional emissions. And then there are other greenhouse gases as well, halogens and refrigerants and N2O from agriculture, for example. I want to mention that a lot of what I'll be talking about today is inspired by Project Drawdown. You can learn more about them at drawdown.org. It's a collection of scientists and social scientists and many people who have done a thorough analysis of climate change and potential solutions. So I mentioned a few sources of greenhouse gases. If we want to break it down by sector, roughly equal parts from the electricity and heat production industry, from industry, other industry, and agriculture are responsible for about 3/4 of the greenhouse gases that are being emitted. Other significant contributors include transportation and buildings and the energy that we use for all sorts of other things. So these are the primary sources. We can also take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and bring it back down to Earth in a couple of different ways, and these we would call sinks. So the primary land sink is photosynthesis, where plants take CO2 in the process of growing to make sugars and carbohydrates. We also have ocean and coastal sinks. So photosynthesis can also happen in the ocean, things like kelp. And carbon dioxide can be absorbed into the water itself. This is actually not a great thing because it changes the acidity of the ocean. And absorbed CO2 can then go into forming shells to be sequestered. So we can think about the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in an analogous way to the way that we might think about the amount of water in a bathtub. So if you're filling up a bathtub, you might have water coming in through the faucet, and you would have water coming out through the drain. And if the rate in and the rate out are equal to each other, then the water level in the bathtub stays fixed. But if you start filling faster than you drain, then the water level goes up until something disastrous happens. And something similar is happening with greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. We are putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at a rate that's more than double the rate that we can take them out. So what can we do about this? So again, Project Drawdown has a framework for thinking about this and kind of goes along with the sources and sinks idea. We need to reduce sources, support sinks, and improve society. And they have broken this down into sectors, including electricity, food, agriculture, and land use, industry, transportation, buildings, land sinks, ocean sinks, and improving society. But we need to get a little bit more specific if we really want to understand what can be done. So this is a pie chart that breaks those up into various different means and at different levels. Before I get into any details of particular solutions, I think the primary message is that we already have the solutions that we need to address climate change. We have the potential to scale these up at a level that would meet the need and keep global warming, say, to within 1.5 or 2 degrees C. What's important to recognize is that we're going to need a lot of solutions. So Drawdown has looked at over 80 solutions that have significant impact. There is no one solution that can do it. So if you see, on the internet, the one thing to do to stop climate change, that is clickbait, not reality. We have to do a lot of things. We have the technology. What we really need now is the will to act quickly and boldly at a lot of levels. The individual level, the institutional level, and the economy and government level. And all of these things have to be moving together quickly. Okay, so I want to take some time now in the next 10 minutes or so to talk about some particular solutions. And if we think about what are some solutions to climate change, if I just asked you that question and waited for some responses, probably what would come out would be things like wind turbines and solar panels and electric vehicles and switching to LEDs. And these are some technological solutions, and they're really quite important ones. So this size of the pie piece here says the potential to the overall contribution to trying to stop climate change. So wind turbines is a lot. Solar panels is a lot. LEDs and electric vehicles are a little bit less, but still significant. But there's a whole lot of other things here that people don't normally think about. So another technical solution is refrigerants, and we'll talk about those later, but those are also important for addressing climate change. Things like reforestation of both tropical and temperate forests. So planting trees is a way that we can help to remove CO2 from the atmosphere once it's already up there. And I think that's a pretty obvious one also. But there's some other things that are also not so obvious. And a huge amount of our resources goes into food. So if we can move towards more plant-rich diets and reducing food waste, that has the same kind of impact as wind or solar. And health and education is also a really important one too. Okay, so we have to think about this from a whole variety of perspectives. Some solutions are technical, some are more behavioral, but we need all of them. Okay, so we'll start with electricity because that's a really big one. Burning fossil fuels like coal or natural gas to make electricity emits CO2. We can go to alternatives like solar and wind that are nearly zero carbon sources of electricity. And these graphs show some projections from different agencies of what's likely to happen in the future. With renewables significantly expanding, solar and wind are going to be growing by a lot. So in wind power, we take kinetic energy from the wind and turn it into electrical energy. And if you see a single typical wind turbine out there, it produces enough electricity to power about 1,000 homes. And the largest wind farm in the United States can power over 500,000 homes. So this is a really significant contribution that is very low carbon electricity. Likewise, solar panels or solar photovoltaics can convert sunlight into electricity with very little emissions. There's no moving parts. It's usually made from silicon. And we can do this at different scales. So I have solar panels on my house. They produce more than enough electricity to supply our home for the year. You can also look at utility scale solar farms like this one out in California, which produces enough electricity for about 160,000 homes. So if you're interested in learning more about solar, I do teach a solar cells course in winter. It's more STEM focused, but that'll be taught in winter of 2022. And we want to go to wind and solar because it's low carbon, but it's a hard sell if it's expensive. And 10 years ago, that was the case. Solar panels, the prices have come way down in the last decade. And now we're at the point where electricity from wind and solar is competitive with natural gas and cheaper than coal. So there's really good economic justification for moving to these renewables, as well as environmental justification. So if you think about what can you do to try to reduce part of your carbon footprint attributed to electricity, your top priority should be to reduce your electricity usage. So a kilowatt hour saved is a kilowatt hour earned. And there's a lot of things we'll talk about on the next slide that you can do just around the house. You can also, once you've taken care of those more simple things, think about, well, maybe you can switch how you get your electricity at home. You could install solar panels on your house. Of course, this doesn't work for everybody. Some people's houses are in the shade or not south facing. So there's also many options for switching to renewable electricity suppliers. So if you live in Pennsylvania, you can go to makebenproud.com, and within 15 minutes, you can find a renewable electricity source that is probably the same price or maybe even cheaper than what you're paying right now. Okay, so mentioning saving energy. So energy efficiency and reduction are the most effective things that you can do, both in terms of cost effectiveness and in terms of impact. So you can look at your home and try to reduce your heating and cooling needs. You can change your set points on the thermostat so you're not cooling so much in the summer or heating so much in the winter. Seal the building envelope, use sufficient insulation and double pane windows. All these things make your home more comfortable. They ultimately save you money, and they're good for the planet. Likewise, with switching to LED lighting, which is much more efficient than incandescent or compact fluorescent, going to energy efficient appliances and so forth. You can get energy audits, either ones you do yourself or professional ones, to help you identify the most impactful, low-hanging fruit, high impact opportunities. Okay, moving beyond electricity, I want to talk about some of the other things that maybe people don't think about so much for climate change that are really important solutions. And one is food. If we think about how do we get food, it takes a lot of resources. It takes land, which is likely converted from forest into something that absorbs less CO2 than what the forest would have. It takes, in many cases, fertilizers and energy to grow and harvest those crops. Then you have to transport them. There's frequently a cold chain that's involved. And for things like cows, they are also producing methane from their belches because they're ruminant animals. So there's a whole lot of climate impact from food. Now, actually, transportation is a relatively small contribution. So buying local is great because you support local businesses, but really the much bigger impact in terms of climate is buying the right things and then eating what you buy. So about 30 to 40% of food made in the United States is wasted. And that is also wasted resources and a wasted opportunity to feed people who might be hungry. Also, if we look at this chart on the left, this shows, it may be too small for you to see well, but this shows the carbon footprint. So kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of food for a bunch of different foods. And the summary statement is that the things that are at the top are primarily animal-based, and beef is by far the worst. And the things that are at the bottom are plant-based, so fruits, vegetables, grains. So converting to a more plant-rich diet is going to have a big impact on your carbon footprint. In addition to consuming food, we also consume a lot of other materials and goods, and these also require resources and energy to produce. So in the United States, you may be surprised to learn that about 3 million pounds of water per person per year are cleaned for us. And only about 12% of that is direct use. The rest goes into other industry, but that's a lot of water. Concrete, steel, glass, and plastic are some of the other materials that are made at really large scale. And these are for, in some cases, building buildings, in other cases for more personal use. So one thing you can do is reduce your consumption all around. So clothing, gadgets, all the other stuff that we have. If we use less stuff, we can reduce our carbon footprint. If you can't reduce or avoid, try to reuse or recycle. Another one that we don't typically think about is refrigerants. So as we have more and more people in the developing world, we're going to have more and more refrigeration needs, not just for refrigerators, but also air conditioners and heat pumps. And the molecules that are used as the working fluid in these pieces of equipment have a global warming potential that's at least 1,000 times worse than carbon dioxide for what's generally out there. There are low global warming potential refrigerant molecules that are available, and the switch to move towards those has started. New regulations will be coming online in the next couple of years, but the faster we can go to those molecules, the better. And we need to make sure that we manage the existing stock so we don't accidentally release some of these pretty bad molecules into the atmosphere. Transportation is another place where we can think about climate solutions and climate impacts. So reducing mileage is a big way to reduce your transportation carbon footprint. We can do this with telepresence. So we've all become very familiar with Zoom in the last year and a half, and this is helping to reduce global carbon footprint. You can move to other modes of transportation. So instead of driving, maybe there are opportunities where you could bike or walk or take public transportation. Okay, if you are driving or something else like that, using efficient vehicles with improved aerodynamics or switching to cleaner forms of electricity or cleaner forms of energy. So switching from a gasoline powered car to an electric car can reduce your carbon footprint as well. And then a non-technical solution is improving society. And this is something, of course, that we want to do anyway for tons of reasons. And the climate benefits are just a bonus. So trying to enhance equity among all different groups of people, educating girls, encouraging family planning. These are things that are important for just human rights and also will benefit climate. So there's over 100 million girls worldwide that don't have full access to education for a variety of historical and cultural reasons. A lot of times this gender inequity is exacerbated by things like poverty and conflict and even climate change itself. And I mentioned gender at the beginning here, but there are also analogous inequities for other marginalized groups based on race and ethnicity, gender identity, and so forth. So trying to empower all of these people, and girls and women in particular, to lead more healthy and prosperous lives is actually also going to lead to having a smaller number of people on the planet that we need to support. So full education for girls and access to contraception could lead to hundreds of millions of fewer people in the coming decades. And that means that we have less people that we need to supply with all the things it takes to live. Again, the reason to do this is not about climate change. It is about doing the right thing for people. But climate change impacts are a bonus. So as I said earlier, we have the solutions that we need if we can scale them quickly. The more we drag our feet, the worse things are going to become, and it may lead to some desperation later on. So geoengineering is the large-scale intervention in the Earth's systems to counteract climate change. And carbon geoengineering can include things like planting trees, and this is a more natural solution. Could also include things like direct air capture, which is an experimental technology that may have some potential drawbacks. But the ones that get really more scary for me are solar geoengineering. Things like putting giant mirrors in space or intentionally seeding the clouds with aerosols to change the amount of sunlight that makes it to Earth. These are experiments that I hope we never have to try, but they are things that people are starting to think about. But hopefully we can get by with the other solutions if we act fast. So I think there's a really useful simulator on climate from MIT called En-ROADS. So you can go check this out, where they've got a bunch of sliders here. And you can tell what is the leverage that we have available to us from some of these different sectors. And what you learn from this is the same story that I've told you so far, which is we have the technology that we need. It is possible to keep the temperature rise to 1.5 or 2 degrees C, but it's going to take a lot. It's not going to be easy. So this gives you a little idea of what it might take. So again, drawdown.org has a fairly comprehensive framework for understanding solutions to climate change. If you want to have 30 hours of material on what I've just talked about for 15 minutes, you can look in spring of 2022 for my course Solutions to Climate Change, which is taught both out of the Chemical Engineering Department and also out of the Honors College. Unlike the solar cells course, this is totally interdisciplinary. There are no prerequisites at all. So anyone is welcome. So start thinking about what actions can you take. And again, there are actions to take at the individual level, trying to kind of scale that up to friends and family, to your local institutions. And then there's also the high level policy, government, and economy. And things need to be done everywhere. And we're going to hear more from our next couple of speakers on things like communication and government and policy and what the challenges and opportunities are there. But I'll try to leave with a hopeful message, which is that we have the solutions. And now the question is, do we have the will to enact them fast enough? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baxter. This was really informative. And I've taken the class myself, and I learned a lot. So addressing climate change is not just installing solar panels or wind turbines. It's a responsibility that it's a multifaceted problem, and its responsibility falls on every human being. And I really encourage people to take the class, undergrads or grads. So now we have heard from the technological perspectives that we do have a lot of solutions to climate change. Next, we're gonna hear about the policy and part of it and the impacts of or the relationships between the states and policymaking and environmentalism from our next speaker, Dr. Christian Hunold. So a little bit background about Dr. Christian Hunold. He's a full-time professor in the Department of Politics here at Drexel, and he's also affiliated with Drexel University's Center for Science, Technology, and Society, STES for short, and the Center for Public Policy as well. His work has advanced several research agendas in the studies of deliberative democracy, social movements, and environmental political theory. He published a book entitled The Green States and Social Movements in 2003, which is considered to be a modern classic of environmental movement studies, and it examines the complex relationships between states and environmentalism. His current research is situated at the junction of environmental political theory and human-animal studies. And this work kind of highlights the interspecies entanglement after nature, and seeks to understand how the blurring of human and non-human words is generating new forms of environmental political receptivity and engagement. So Professor Hunold also serves on the editorial board of the prestigious Environmental Politics peer-reviewed journal. And he's going to talk to us today about policymaking. Dr. Hunold.
Thank you, Sharif. I'm going to, as Jason has done, to try to squeeze a 10-week course, environmental politics, into about 15 minutes. We'll see how well this works. I call this presentation 3 Problems of Climate Politics, or maybe 3 Challenges. It's a very big picture look at what I think are some of the main obstacles, perhaps, to implementing a lot of the technical solutions that we've heard from the previous presenter. And there's sort of 3 problems. One is sort of doomism. The second is faith in the technical fix. And the final problem is the sort of sustainability itself, for lack of a better word. In all of these cases, what I'm talking about are ways that doomism, the technical fix, and sustainability sort of actually play out in politics. So there may be perfectly normatively adequate, desirable forms of doomism, of technical solutions to climate change, and of sustainability. But for better or for worse, those more desirable conceptions are not necessarily the ones that frame actual climate change politics. So what is doomism? So I'm not engaging with denialism, which is sort of a whole other kind of problem. But doomism in some ways is denialism redux in sort of a different, in its sort of place, the space it sort of occupies. And here I'm talking primarily about doomist, catastrophizing, apocalyptic narratives in media coverage about climate change, but also ways that a lot of climate activists themselves, like Greta Thunberg, talk about climate change. So perhaps David Wallace-Wells in the United States, environmental journalist, is probably the most sort of well-known contemporary doomist, right? The uninhabitable earth. It is, I promise, worse than you think, he wrote in a New York Magazine article a couple of years ago. Indeed, absent a significant adjustment to how billions of humans conduct their lives, parts of the earth will likely become close to uninhabitable and other parts horrifically inhospitable as soon as the end of this century. And what's sort of interesting here is that in the media coverage of climate change politics, not just in the United States, but in lots of other places too, it's this focus on disaster, decline, death, catastrophe that overwhelms all of the other stuff. Indeed, the significant adjustments that would need to be made. So a kind of overwhelming doomism. This drives a lot of climate scientists themselves crazy. Michael Mann responds to this. Many of the prominent doomist narratives, whether it's Jonathan Franzen, David Wallace Wells, 360.org, if you like, can be traced back to a false notion that the Arctic methane bomb will cause runaway warming and extinguish all life on Earth within 10 years. This is completely wrong. There's no science to support that. So what is wrong with doomist narratives? The major question here is a political question, I think. Are apocalyptic discourses self-defeating because they squash agency and the desire to change things? Or are they effective because they create a sense of urgency? I tend to think they are predominantly unhelpful. And this is primarily because doomism seems to me to be closely associated with an older environmentalist discourse that is sometimes called limits discourse, survivalist politics, or in its more modern incarnation, we hear about planetary boundaries from the Rockström Institute, although I think Johan Rockström is now in Potsdam in Berlin. And the idea is, right, there's a finite Earth with a finite biosphere, space, food, water, land, all these things are finite, physically finite. And so the obvious policy implication here, primarily drawing down or ending economic growth, right? You can't keep growing infinitely if you're faced with a finite physical space. That policy solution, or even just heading in that direction of public policy, is unfortunately incompatible with the neoliberal economic orthodoxy that sustains capitalism, not just in the West anymore, but increasingly around the world. And so it seems to me not only are doomist narratives psychologically unhelpful, but the policy solutions they imply, accepting limits and then making do with less, and perhaps entirely transforming our economic and political systems, but primarily our economic systems, just doesn't work, right? The policy proposals that come out of this perspective are just not going to be acceptable to major political economic elites. And as I'll say in a little while, most citizens either. All right, so that's sort of one challenge, right? The doomist narrative and what to do about it. The second one is the technical fix, or what I call the billionaires' environmentalism, right? So this is the idea that we can solve policy challenges, including climate change, by introducing new technologies. You know, a classic sort of example, if it's a little bit of a silly example, but I think it drives home the point. You know, in the 1890s and 1900s, people were obsessed by horse manure, right? Because it was sort of everywhere. Horses were the main source of transportation in urban areas, and horse manure was polluting the streets and it's unpleasant and, you know, problems with disease. And this was like, you know, occupying everyone, what to do about horse manure. And of course, nobody thinks about horse manure anymore because we've invented new transportation technologies that have solved that problem overnight. And it's this sort of logic, right, the expectation, the hope, but I think it's stronger than hope. It's a kind of expectation that a new kind of technology will come along to solve problems that we're presently unable to solve. And we don't need to touch, therefore, existing economic systems, social problems, political power relationships that tie all of this together, because a new technology will liberate us from horse manure or climate change. And politics doesn't play a role here, right? I mean, there's lots of books. Bill Gates's new book is in this tradition, doesn't really talk about politics at all, rejects politics maybe as useless and just not very interesting. And so, technologies, carbon capture, nuclear fission, solar radiation management, geoengineering, right? These are the kinds of technical fixes that are sort of in this vein of the technical fix approach to solving climate change. So what are the problems here from a political perspective? One is the sort of anthropocentric hubris that's built into this Promethean worldview, right? Humanity is an exceptional inventive species. We possess incredible scientific knowledge and technological capacities that have allowed us in the past to change our environment, to modify environment to our collective benefit. And this is something we can keep doing. And qualitatively, there's no, in principle, no difference between climate change and tackling horse manure, right? This is all undergirded by an unquestioning belief in progress as a function of capitalist growth, despite much evidence to the contrary, right? So that's the sort of the main problem with the technical fix is that it ignores politics, rejects politics, doesn't think we really need to engage with political power one way or another because a new kind of technology will come to the rescue. The third challenge or problem is the sort of delusion of sustainability, sort of actually existing sustainability here. I'm well aware that there are more radical, more promising, potentially more interesting conceptions of sustainability out there, but they're not the ones that have necessarily taken hold of the popular political imagination. And there's an argument to be made that it is at least I think it's not an implausible argument, that sustainability itself is a kind of obstacle to more far-reaching kinds of transformations. This is the post-politics hypothesis developed by Ingolfsson Brudon in Wiesbaden a couple of decades ago. And it's the idea that I think describes our moment perfectly well, where most, again, outside of climate change denial, most ordinary people in advanced consumer societies accept simultaneously the green cause. So environmental problems are real, climate change is real, but also at the same time, the non-negotiable right to overconsume, right? So a lot of the solutions that we hear about are always ideas to substitute fossil fuels with other kinds of technologies to maintain present rates of consumption, perhaps even to increase rates of consumption. There's very little political discussion, usually, about reducing consumption. And so there's this sort of distinctive feature of our environmental politics, not just in the United States, where, of course, denialism is sort of an additional problem, but at least in sort of global northern states around the world. We've amassed an unprecedented level of scientific understanding, even public awareness of the social, environmental implications of our modern lifestyles, but we're unwilling to give up those lifestyles, right? In fact, we're sort of determined to defend and further develop those values of kind of, liberal individualism and materialist consumption. And so what you then get is a kind of performative environmental governance where what it does is not to solve climate change. What it does is not to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it sort of has a different function, right? It's almost a kind of psychological coping mechanism, where something like the Paris Agreement enables liberal consumer societies to manage our inability and our unwillingness to fight for and achieve the sociological transformation that we need in order to sort of address these problems. And instead, we get this kind of what Brudon calls the collaborative management of sustained unsustainability, right? So environmental governance is a almost purely performative, symbolic politics that doesn't actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which indeed haven't really been reduced. So what is to be done? Where does this lead? Is there a more promising climate politics anywhere here. And I think there's sort of 3 points here. Again, this is very big picture. One is perhaps to reframe climate change from a crisis, from a sort of immediate, sort of medical emergency to a chronic condition. Maybe not as simple as sort of managing something like high blood pressure, where actually we have often a good, perfectly good sort of technical fix in the form of medication, but maybe more complex, conditions like, diabetes or cancer management, something that isn't going to go away ever, something that's not going to be cured, but something that needs to be managed if you intend on continuing with your life. And as part of that, there would need to be a shift from a kind of immersive ignorance about the implications of our sort of, liberal consumer societies, or maybe not so liberal consumer societies anymore, and a politics that encourages greater ecological receptivity and reflexivity and builds that into our political, social, and economic systems in some way. And we've talked about what that might mean in the discussion. A second sort of strand, I think, that's worth pursuing is to bring politics back into this. And instead of asking the consumer citizen, maybe not instead of, but also asking the consumer citizens, to reduce their household trash or to switch out their light bulbs and do all of those things, to refocus and to redevelop a more confrontational, but also more inclusive environmentalism. In other words, let's pay less attention to the consumer citizen and reemphasize citizens who act collectively and publicly to challenge existing power structures, rather than merely to sort of obsess about our individual carbon footprints in our households, and instead develop a politics where people join together to defend a living world that is under assault from all corners. And of course, this would also mean building a more broad-based environmental movement that is more inclusive of women, of people from the South, the global South, of racial minorities, and so on, a more diverse, more confrontational movement, perhaps around framings like climate justice or planetary justice. And then finally, I think the third point I want to emphasize is that we need to expand our political and policy imagination very generally, beyond, carbon pricing or the sort of standard environmental policies or climate policies that dominate public debate. And so I think we should envision more broadly climate futures in terms of all sorts of policy clusters, many of which, as Jason already indicated, have nothing ostensibly to do with climate change primarily, but still have large effects, right? So if you could lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty through feminist public policies, through perhaps reducing the consumption of the affluent while lifting the consumption of the have-nots, while also pursuing technological solutions to problems that make sense to improve people's lives, to make them safer, to make them more environmentally friendly, I think that will go a long way. So in other words, a politics of climate change that isn't primarily about climate change, if that makes sense. It's very interesting if you take a look at the IPCC and their shared socioeconomic pathways, which now do a much better job of bringing in social, economic, political factors into this. You sort of get an idea of where this might be going, instead of just sort of only talking about the climate science. And that is it for today.
That was very, very insightful. Thank you so much, Professor Hunold, for navigating such a sensitive topic so skillfully. It's not very easy discussion to have, especially around politics, and we are not routinely, like in our society, I think it's globally, that we consider these things as taboo, yet they affect our lives very, very closely. And I'm very happy with all the important points that you touched on. Next, we will hear from Dr. Suruchi Sood, who is an expert in the public health field. So now we have heard about the technological perspective, we heard about the political perspective, and now we need to learn about what could be the social impacts as well. So our third speaker for today is Dr. Suruchi Sood, who's an associate professor in the Department of Community Health and Prevention, located in the School of Public Health here at Drexel. Dr. Sood's 30-year research career has spanned diverse areas, particularly the design, implementation, and evaluation of the health communication efforts to promote behavior and social change. She has managed communication research within a variety of contexts like social media and community mobilization. Her researcher skills cover the range of advanced multivariate statistical modeling to community-based participatory visual and narrative techniques. So Professor Sood, global portfolio includes managing capacity building and research projects in over 30 low and middle income countries worldwide. So Dr. Sood is also the recipient of the prestigious Everett Rogers Award for her outstanding contributions to the field of public health. And Dr. Sood, you can take it from here.
Thank you so much, Sharif, for that wonderful introduction. I am going to just give me 30 seconds to get set up because I'd like to share my screen for a presentation that I pulled together. All right. Can I just get a thumbs up to make sure that everybody can see? Excellent. Thank you so much for that. So what I'm going to be talking about today is climate change communication. So let's jump right in and figure out, so what is climate change communication? And what it is using communication channels to create, engage, and reinforce people's knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, and also to change norms at a variety of levels. So at the individual level, at a community level, at an organizational level, at a policy level. And specifically, climate change communication refers to the efforts that we make to mitigate or adapt to climate change using communication. There's two things that I want to point out up front. The first one is that language matters. So in health communication, we follow what we call the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which says that language influences thought rather than the reverse. And so, for example, if there is no word for a particular phenomenon, does it even exist? And to give you an unrelated example, in Hindi, which is my native language, the words for ice and snow are the same. We don't have a distinction between ice and snow. Whereas the Inuit in Arctic dwelling Inuits have several words to describe snow, just different types of snow. And the reason I bring this up is because the way the communication channels or popular media has portrayed climate change is important. The language we use is important. So for example, global warming. So when we refer to global warming, one of the things that research has shown is that it's really less understood than the words climate change, right? People don't quite understand what global warming is, at least the general public. The word climate change has been increasingly politicized, and it wasn't even allowed to be on several governmental websites less than a year ago. And then, of course, there's the environmentalists or the alarmists who refer to everything as a climate crisis. And these things do play an important role in what perceptions we have and what we know, feel, and do about climate change. The rest of this talk, I'm really going to focus on the media approaches, both negative and positive. And because media that we consume does reflect reality, right? And so it influences everything that we do. And, media and media coverage, media framing is important to keep in mind. So let me just start off with what are some of the research show when you look at what people know, feel, and do. So people have limited knowledge of causes and consequences, and indeed in the sphere of public health, very limited recognition of health effects of climate change. Beliefs, which is, there is an awareness of global climate change, and people know it's bad or it should be a concern, but the belief that it's human beings that are causing climate change varies by country and context. And then we come to behavior. In terms of behavior, although we notice there's belief and concern about climate change, people are unlikely to take mitigation behaviors. And so what we did was, part of my research involved looking at the global media around climate change. And one of our key findings was that the climate change media can be separated into two components. The first is the way climate change is portrayed in what I'm going to be just calling the global north, and then the next one is the global south. So let's look at some of the categories that we were able to create when it comes to media programming around climate change. So the first one is purposeful messaging, where we're actually using the media in a very thoughtful and creative way to address climate change. Then we have satires on television. We have messaging in popular entertainment. We have documentaries. We have children's programming, which also sort of falls under the rubric of eco-anxiety, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And cli-fi, which is climate fiction, sort of similar to what Dr. Hunold was talking about with doomism. So let's look at each of these, or what I wanted to do is just show you examples of each of these. So the first one I'm going to talk about is purposeful messaging. Hollywood Health and Society is a program at the University of Southern California, Annenberg School of Communication. And what it provides is the entertainment education, the entertainment industry in Hollywood. It gives them up-to-date information on storylines on health, safety, security, and climate change. So they have several funding organizations, and they provide quick facts, briefings, consultations, case examples, panel discussions, and also a quarterly newsletter. And these two very popular shows on television actually have worked with Hollywood Health and Society to incorporate climate change messaging into their specific program. So one of them is Madam Secretary, which was on CBS, and another was an episode of ABC's Modern Family. And these are shows that have a wide range of reach. Next is we have satirical television, which is, so for example, research done by Brewer and Knight showed that the Daily Show, when it was hosted by Jon Stewart, and things are obviously different now, shaped public opinion about climate change, regardless, and this is important, regardless of political and the ideological leaning of the viewers. And this is important because there is that notion that Democrats support climate change, whereas conservatives don't. And so that's important to keep in mind, that their media can sort of bridge the divide. The next is sort of this unplanned climate change messaging within popular entertainment. And this is one of my favorite examples, because if you look at Game of Thrones, after the show was produced and after it gained wide recognition, George R.R. Martin, the writer, he claimed that, the climate crisis we are in today has a great parallel to what's happening in the Game of Thrones in terms of winter is coming. So although it's a fictional world, there is a great parallel because they're sort of talking about climate crisis there. And this, like I said, it's popular entertainment, which, sort of not planned wise, not, thoughtfully, but actually does have climate change messaging. And then we have documentaries, and documentaries are important to consider because they're really, if you look at them as sort of the creative treatment of actuality, right? And so there are wide variety of genres and formats. So there's docudramas, there's docu-comedies, and there's two that I wanted to specifically highlight. One was called Ain't Your Mama's Heatwave, and the second one, which probably several people have heard of, which is An Inconvenient Truth. Next, what we have in the media is children's programming. So it's a well-known fact that young people are more concerned about climate change than an older generation. However, a review of 25 climate change programs in the US found only 4 which had an episode of climate change content. And so that's important to keep in mind, that we're not really spending time or devoting time in children's programming on climate change. And then the other finding that was important was also that when climate change is mentioned, it is done in a way that it induces a great deal of anxiety. And so there are actually two popular shows. One is Blackish and the other one is Big Little Lies. And they both have storylines of young people in school who are worried about the effects of climate change and are not sure what their future looks like. And, you know, the researchers have coined a term called the creation of eco-anxiety. And then finally, we have what is called cli-fi, or climate fiction. And this has, you know, really spawned a whole genre of film and television, which is called climate fiction. And so these are mostly sort of written in the dystopian future, right, where it's already too late to do anything about climate change, so sort of the doomsday perspective. And one movie that I wanted to specifically illustrate was The Day After Tomorrow, that deals with climate change. Now, what we found was things are slightly different actually in the global South. And, you know, since most of my work is global, we looked at trends in climate change programming in the global South. And what we found was that in the global South, there are several examples of programming that is designed to be entertaining, but also has an educational message. So film and television is not just about popular entertainment, it is also about educating the public. And so it's not an add-on to your popular television, but there are actually programs that are designed specifically to get across a climate change message. And the global warming and climate change are considered to be a development concern. They're not a standalone concern, right? But it's a part of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, right? It's a part and parcel of the larger human condition. Also, we noticed that, you know, most of the program in Global South is actually led by organizations that are funded through a variety of donors, and they have long histories of working in the Global South, specifically in low and middle income countries. I have some examples here. There's PCI Media, there's BBC Media Action, and then at Hopkins, there's the Center for Communication Programs. And the last thing we discovered in the Global South, which is different, is that, you know, the narrative around climate change isn't focused around mitigation per se. It is really focused around lived experiences. So, you know, what are the experiences that their audiences are going through now as a result of climate change? So they're current, the issues are real. And it's not an abstract phenomenon that's going to happen in the future. It's talking more about what people are doing now and today to adapt to climate change. There are several missing connections, of course, when we're looking at the media. One, it's of lower priority in the media than other social, personal, and health issues. There is the belief that, you know, the risks are greater, but the risks are greater for other people. It's the them, and it's not really as great to oneself. There's also this belief of what we call psychological distancing, which is, you know, the consequences will happen. Yeah, but, you know, they're going to be 30 years from now. And people aren't necessarily worried about benefits that arrive 30 years from now. They're more worried about barriers and benefits from today. There's also this lack of confidence, like, okay, climate change is an issue, it's a big issue, but there's really nothing I can do about it. So that's like lack of self-efficacy. And then also, you know, this lack of response efficacy, which is A, I don't have the confidence that it's an issue I can tackle. B, I can't really respond in a meaningful way because I'm one of 8 billion people. So, you know, there's really no response. And then there's sort of this division between, you know, programming that looks at fatalism, like, again, going back to the whole doomsday message, or there's this sort of optimism that, you know, the human race will survive somehow magically, it'll all go away. So, you know, there's sort of this duality instead of looking at the real issues. So there are several communication solutions. One is the importance of tackling climate change, not necessarily only as a global issue, you know, but also as a local issue. That's something that's happening now. Very important to connect climate change to priorities such as health and safety, right? Instead of tackling climate change as a separate element, but really putting it as part of the Sustainable Development Goals. Next is to show current impacts. So the whole thing about it's not in the distant future. Using positive frames to encourage hope. So, the whole idea of it's not too late. And also, where people have lower perceptions of severity, where they don't think it's as severe or they don't think they're susceptible to climate change. So the threat levels are low. It's important to have a combination of both negative and positive programming. And finally, it's really important to look at the specific actions that can be taken, because most people are, they know about it, they have positive attitudes about it, but they don't know what to do about it. And so it's really important for communication messages to really focus on here's what you can do. And also, building in the you can do part, build in components of the confidence as well as the response efficacy, that if you do this, then something will happen. And I just wanted to end with sort of this big picture statement, which is, what we really need for climate change is, we need a great multidisciplinary set of people working together. We need involvement from popular media, but we also need sort of this academic understanding on how to communicate climate change so that it brings about changes in the individual and social behaviors. So, what media allows us to do is it reaches many people. It supports, the general population sort of understand in colloquial terms what climate change is, encouraging audiences to share their questions as well as their concerns, and finally, guide audiences to be empowered and hopeful about the future. So that's pretty much all I had. I'm going to stop sharing and we'll take it from there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sood. This was very nicely put presentation and opened a lot of less known areas, especially about the social movements. And we always get cues in the media we consume. And it was very insightful to know like the different shows and what do they communicate in terms of like social cues. That was very interesting. So thanks to all of our presenters for today. We had such nice presentations and very informative talks on averting climate change. To all our audience, please, we are going to open like the Q&A session right now. So please type in your questions or discussions in the chat window. You can also use the Zoom feature to raise your hand, and we will select attendees to talk to our panelists and kind of like have a group-wide discussion. And we can also have questions from between the panelists to each other as well. So questions have started coming in. So we have already one question from Anna Ortigoza to Dr. Baxter. And the attendee is asking, Dr. Baxter, are you referring to reproductive education for girls or education as a pathway for economic and social empowerment?
Both. So I think at first level, just general education as a pathway to economic and social empowerment is really important. So only about 2/3 of countries have gender parity in education at the elementary level, and only about 1/4 of countries have gender parity at the high school level. So even getting basic education for girls will allow them to have some agency and make decisions in life that will benefit them in lots of ways in terms of prosperity and in terms of family planning. And then both in those countries and in other countries like ours, having more access to reproductive education is also going to be really helpful for family planning. And not just education, but actually also providing access to contraception so that you can make it as easy as possible for women and girls to take control of their own reproductive choices.
That's a very excellent answer. And I think that women more and more, they become the breadwinners worldwide, and they are the head of the households in terms of educating their kids as well. So we need to emphasize the role of educating girls. The second question is from Britt Folstick. And I think this question is particularly addressed to Dr. Sood. He says, like, this is all great information and a lot to think about. What CC-related policies are being considered or should we advocate for here in Philadelphia? That's a pretty broad question, but we kind of like, if you wanted to give us a summary of what policies are being considered locally or even nationwide, globally, what are the most up-to-dates happening?
So I honestly wouldn't know much about what is happening locally. Like I said, all of my work is global in nature. But I think the one global movement that has happened that we take a great deal of pride in is the fact that climate change is now being connected with other human issues. So I was really happy to see Dr. Baxter talk about family planning, for example, because contraceptive use has been a part of public health programs for a long time. So by incorporating climate change, by incorporating sustainable issues into the Sustainable Development Goals that the entire world is following, over 170 countries, it really sort of brings things to the forefront, but also helps us integrate it better with other issues that are of concern to us as human beings as a whole. I don't know if any of the other speakers have anything to add to that in terms of policy.
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Philadelphia, there's a lot of interesting, well, you know, it's always both. It's always and both, right? On the one hand, there are some very interesting developments around energy efficiency and reworking the city's surfaces, right, to sort of find more natural ways, I suppose, to sort of manage stormwater, right? Given that more rainfall is one of the long-term consequences of climate change. There's already sort of manifesting in the mid-Atlantic, right, to deal with flooding. You know, at the same time, it's a city where we have effectively, you know, 1 million inhabitants or so are poor, you know, by global North standards, very poor. So really simple things, right? We just last month, we put a coat of white paint on top of our roof, and instantly the temperature on the second floor dropped by about 15 or 20 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So this is not particularly expensive. It costs a couple $100 to buy the paint, and I provided the labor. You know, why isn't this done city? Why is there not a mandate, right, that you have to paint your roof white? You know, this would probably actually save lives, right? People wouldn't fry to death in their homes if this were available. So ultimately, I think it's also an example that, you know, as long as hundreds of thousands of people are poor and have neither the resources, nor roof access, right, nor control over their property, you know, a simple policy that saves lives and makes everybody more comfortable is a non-starter, right? So that's, you know, yeah, on the one hand, yeah, we can talk about, you know, LEED certifications for office buildings. That's very nice. Unfortunately, it doesn't really address what are arguably bigger problems.
Absolutely.
Just to tidy up on the previous question, Anna made an excellent comment in the chat that family planning is not just a matter for girls. That's, of course, exactly true. Very good. I didn't mean to mislead in that way. Family planning is for all. Regarding what can be done in the city, I just put into the chat, Philadelphia this past year released their climate playbook. Philadelphia Climate Action Playbook is what they call it, and you can find it online. So that has some of the city's goals, and there are things like improving public transit, having more bike-friendly cities. As Christian was indicating, actually there's a lot of things that we can do around the home for weatherizing, and particularly helping low-income people to weatherize their homes would allow them to live more comfortably and would save on energy costs, which is good for the climate. So there are so many things that are mutually beneficial that we should be trying to go after those for multiple reasons, and hopefully we will.
Great. Thank you all for this wonderful insights. I think humans are very messy and very complicated, and technology, it's not just about technology or policy or social. And one of the biggest outcomes of events like these is to facilitate the transfer of knowledge between the different aspects from technology or policy and social. So we continue to take questions, and there is a question from Hugh Johnson. And he's asking, are there any lessons learned from the pandemic that we can apply to climate change? And I think that's an interesting question. A lot has happened in the past year that triggered a lot of needed change in technology as well as in our behavior. So specifically with regards to communication, example, vaccine hesitancy or conspiracy theory, and political responses, for example, public health medication measures and the idea of individual freedoms. So that's a kind of a beefy question, and I think all of our panelists will have something to say about it. So we can start with Professor Hunold about the political aspect of it.
Yeah, so, you know, last year I read a very interesting article where someone had made an argument to the effect that the pandemic was sort of, you know, climate change training wheels, right? Because it was teaching states, and this was about US states, you know, actually have very, you know, very different sort of capacities across the 50 states. But basically the idea was that, you know, managing the pandemic and responding to the pandemic would sort of be a trial run for doing the kinds of things that states will need to be doing to manage climate change. And that, you know, that was plausible, I think, as far as it went. But I also think that the pandemic has taught us and maybe reminded us once again that solving these kinds of sort of wicked policy problems are not primarily about communicating and teaching and disseminating the facts. I think as scientists, we sometimes make the mistake that we think, you know, people are dumb and it's our job, or uninformed, to put it more neutrally, and it's our job as scientists to sort of inform them of the facts, and then things will fall into place, right? Why wouldn't you want to be saved from a deadly disease? Why wouldn't you want to be saved from cooking to death in your overheated home in the summer, right? This seems obvious. And yet it isn't, right? It's values. It's people's pre-existing political beliefs and values and frames through which they view the world that are just immune to being changed by facts most of the time, right? Particularly perhaps in older adults, maybe somewhat less so in younger people. But even there, I think there's already a lot of, you know, by the time you're sort of 20, 25 years old, you have a worldview that's outside of, you know, World War III, almost impossible to change. And so I think the question then, I think the other lesson from the pandemic is that we sort of realized that our sort of playbook of pandemic response, which is on some level rooted in the idea of social solidarity and that most people value collective safety, you know, that was very patchy. That worked in some places. It didn't really work at all in others. And then the next question is, well, then how do you appeal to people's actually existing values, right? To get them to behave more safely. Macron is now trying this in France, right? Where he's about to introduce vaccine mandates that are basically intending to punish people for the kinds of things they enjoy doing, which is to consume, right? So apparently starting in August, unless you're vaccinated, you're not going to be allowed in restaurants, in shops, in concerts, in other public events, which requires, of course, a certain state capacity to enforce that. But again, at least it would be an idea, right? Where you're trying to hit people where their values lie, right? If the idea is that people want to be entertained, they want to go to a restaurant, and this is not something they can now do because they're not vaccinated. So instead of appealing to their sort of sense of solidarity and things that clearly aren't working. So that's a lesson, right? Develop strategies that meet people where they are, however sort of distasteful you might find where they are, right? Which is however rational you think they are. Probably the more promising approach.
You brought up a very important point about psychology, and you said like people like to consume, and that is something that is, I'm not sure if it's ingrained, like perhaps we need some like a psychologist input from that, but or we got actually trained by our society to consume more. And I think it's in connection with communication. So I'm interested also to listen to Dr. Sood's input about regarding the impacts of the pandemic on how it triggered like lessons in regards to climate change, particularly vaccine hesitancy and conspiracy theory?
So it's an interesting question because I've been doing some work around COVID and vaccine hesitancy, not in the US, but in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And one of the things that I often do when I'm doing my trainings is sort of link climate change and what's been happening with climate change for many years with what's happening during the COVID pandemic. And I don't know if this is a lesson learned exactly, but one thing COVID has done is it's really made people realize that there is a field called public health. I've spent 30 years of my life explaining to people, like I still have my family members going, what is it that you do exactly? And so, you know, this crisis has really sort of made public health front and center, and to make people realize that, you know, it is important, and sort of also the connectedness of the globe, right? It's like what happens in Vegas actually never stays in Vegas, right? And it is sort of global in nature. And so therefore the pandemic is also made us all realize how connected we are. So instead of looking at it, well, it's their problem or it's them and it's us here, it's made the world look at the world as a much closer place where all our destinies are interconnected.
Absolutely, absolutely. You couldn't be more true. I think before the pandemic, we used to have a very fragmented society, like even in the language, we say developed countries versus developing countries. And it's one pandemic and one virus that virtually impeded the lives of people all over the planet. So we only have one planet to care about. So next we have a question from Carolyn Cameron. She's asking, what recommendations do you have regarding dissemination of information on climate change mitigation to the general public in a way that will convince them of its importance and what they can do to participate? Again, that's a very kind of multifaceted question. So we can start with Dr. Baxter.
Sure. So I had actually put something a little later into the chat. There's a really excellent TED Talk by Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, which I would highly recommend. That it talks about how to talk to people about climate change at the individual level and at the level of small groups. And one of the things that she really emphasizes is, as Christian had said, try to meet people where they are or understand where they're coming from. And I think one thing is to make people aware that climate change is not just something that happens to other people, but it's something that can happen here. And to figure out, you know, depending on where they live, what are some of the potential threats? If people think, you know, climate change is about a polar bear standing on an iceberg, that's not very immediate. But if you're realizing, oh, the forest fires that are happening right now and the flooding in Germany and so many other things, and, you know, this could happen to me, and my beach house could be underwater in 30 years or something like this, right? So it's got to be something that matters to them. Also, in the ability to emphasize that climate change is not just about nature as separate from people, but climate change is about people ourselves. So people's livelihoods and comfort are going to be impacted. And then the other thing is, I think, to try to find things that people are interested in that would be affected by climate change, whether that is, you know, maybe one thing that most people are interested in is the well-being of their children or grandchildren or something, but then there also are many other things, you know, everyday activities that they like doing that could be impacted. And finding ways that they can take some action that could potentially make some difference. And not everybody is comfortable, you know, diving into what happens at the government and policy level, and other people are comfortable that are, you know, you might want to act more individually, and just finding things that people are willing to take a step. And I had mentioned food before, and you don't have to overnight go to being vegan for this to work. But if you can just start moving and have a few less meat meals, or at least have chicken instead of beef or something like that, what are the things you can do to make a difference? And as Suruchi had said earlier, kind of finding this medium ground where your actions can make a difference, where it's not so daunting that it's hopeless, but you can actually start doing something that matters.
Excellent answer. And I think there's a lot of lessons on the personal level that we learned from today's panel. So there's usually a very long value chain between what could happen in the other part of the world until it reaches us. There is an old saying in my home country that says, like, the fly in Japan could cause an earthquake in California. So you never know how you're going to be affected, but you also need to, I think it's like everybody needs to tailor their messages so that in a way that relates to people and what do they really need to improve their lives. So in regards to Carolyn's question, Dr. Sood or Dr. Hunold, do you have any other inputs that you want to share?
I think the one thing I was thinking about, I would agree with Dr. Hunold had said about people don't want to be told what to do. So, that whole idea of Nancy Reagan standing on television saying, don't do drugs, that's just the worst messaging possible, right? And I think we have done that with climate change to some extent, where we haven't made the information accessible, and that has created some issues. So I think it's really important, if you want people's participation, is to first let them participate, right? Let them share their own thoughts and views. And I don't know how much we've done that, at least in the communication on the public health literature. And like also the point Dr. Baxter was raising, small steps, right? So for example, the Meatless Monday movement, right? It's not asking you to become a vegan, but it's asking you to not to have meat on Mondays, right? And so it's the small things, like where you start is important, right? So the fact that several of us now feel uncomfortable if we are not carrying our own bags into a grocery store because we don't want to use plastic, right? It's a small thing, but every small thing matters. And it's, that's how things become normative, right? And maybe 10 years from now, plastic bags won't even be a thing. Like I was in Rwanda several years ago, and at the airport, they check your bags to make sure you're not carrying any plastic into the country. They're just not, you're not allowed to bring in any plastic. And, I don't know how much of an impact it's had in the long run, but it's those things, right? And I was like, oh, I'm going to Rwanda. Okay, I better make sure that I'm not carrying any plastic in with me, no Ziplocs, no nothing. And, everything has to be in paper bag. Simple enough, right? So those are the kinds of things. Let people do what they can instead of telling them, this is what you need to do and you need to do it now. Otherwise, we'll all be dead in 5 years or whatever,
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned a very important point about letting people participate and speak. And I think that has to do a lot with social media. So we have multiple platforms, multiple outputs. Everybody can say whatever they want to, but the problem is, at least that's from my opinion, that there is an information overload. We are not able to distinguish between good information and bad information. And that is something where I think part of education can really improve a lot on. Dr. Hunold, could you add your insights?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't think the problem is lack of information, right? I don't think in order for polities to take effective action against climate change that you need to persuade every citizen, that everyone needs to sort of be aware of the differences between various kinds of geoengineering or how you make energy efficient refrigerators or whatever. I think it's not the wrong question. I mean, I also feel somewhat ambivalent about this, right? As a small d Democrat, right? I believe in the idea of popular government and political participation and social movements and power from below and all of that good stuff. But ultimately, I think what we have here is that I think the problem is people know, right? We've had climate politics for, going on 50 years at this point. And I mean, in the US, I think we have a slightly skewed view because we're constantly still dealing with denialism. And so the obvious answer to denialism seems to be, well, it must be lack of information. And I don't think that's the case, really. So ultimately, I see a broader incompatibility between a system which is designed to encourage consumption and economic growth, and the entire thing would collapse like a house of cards if it were to give up the idea of economic growth. And so I think that's unfortunately, I think a more systemic question really here. I mean, Germans now think they're going to save, they're going to prevent global warming by making Mercedes-Benz switch to electric cars, right? And that's as far as the policy imagination goes. And maybe they'll do that a little more quickly. than they would have done before the floods. But if that's the extent of the policy imagination, then nothing is going to change. Then it's just a question of how many million, hundreds of million or billions of people are going to suffer in ways that we presently have a hard time imagining.
Absolutely. And Dr. Baxter was saying earlier, like it really goes beyond wind power or the government just building solar panels or driving an electric car. Climate change requires change in every single aspect of our life. So we have another question. We have 4 minutes remaining, and this question is for Dr. Suruchi Sood. So how you envision communication strategies targeted to children and youth as a way of generating awareness and actions in the whole population?
That's such an excellent question, isn't it? Because that's what I was talking about in terms of children programming. And I believe it was mentioned, I don't remember who did, but education has shown to be the single largest predictor in terms of caring about climate change. And so the one thing is school-based programs, I think, would be a great way. In terms of how do you do something with children that percolates into the larger society, I'm always reminded of the wonderful example of seat belts, right? And how seat belts have become the norm in, like, we do it even without thinking. And one of the strategies that they used for seatbelts was that they told children how important it was to buckle up. And it was the children who then told their parents every time you sit in the car, you need to buckle up. And that has been proven to be one of the biggest predictors of success of people wearing seatbelts, because they do want to listen to what their kids are saying. So, you know, I mean, I'm talking about, we have precedents, I guess is what I'm saying, that, you know, young people or the youth really can play a major role in bringing about change.
Wonderful answer, as always. We are having a lot of people in the chat, and they are very interested, and the discussion can keep going on, but unfortunately, everything beautiful needs to come to an end. Thank you so much to Dr. Jason Baxter, Dr. Christian Hunold, Dr. Suruchi Sood. Your insights are very much valued, and it's a pleasure to have been in this panel and learn a lot from technology, policy, and social aspects. I would like also to remind people that this recording of this event is going to be shared on the Climate and Sustainability website. So before I conclude this event, do any of our guest speakers want to say any final thoughts?
Well, I guess I can't help myself. We also passed laws that made seatbelts mandatory. So.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I guess I will just say, I hope that our audience has enjoyed the presentation and will take some of the things that they've heard about and talk with others about it as well.
That too, absolutely. So please join us for join the Academy of Natural Sciences next Thursday, July 29th at 7 p.m. for the next Academy Town Square entitled Preparing for a Warmer and Wetter Philadelphia. So Jen is putting that in the chat window and the registration link, so you can follow that. Also, the next Drexel Climate Year Speaker Series will be on August 19th at noon as well. And it's gonna be also on climate change and health with another great panel of Drexel faculty. And Jen will also provide the registration link in the chat. This also should pop up right now. So thank you all for your time, and we look forward to meeting you next time. And thank you to our speakers. Have a great evening.